Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Chas Freeman, the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, also a former director of Chinese affairs at the U.S. State Department, and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, among a long list of other high-level positions, which we don't have time to go through all of. So it's great to see you again.
Nice to see you. All those positions just mean I couldn't keep a job. That's all.
Well, I guess the benefit of being able to speak with a top diplomat like yourself is, to figure out some of the diplomatic ins and outs of what is going on now. Because I think for many people, they were struck a bit by what happened with this meeting suddenly popping up in Alaska. So I wanted to ask you about Alaska, but also in the wider direction of U.S. foreign policy, because, there is a recognition that the world is becoming multipolar, as Marco Rubio have argued, but it's still unclear exactly how Washington will respond to this. But again, let's start with Alaska, because this was very sudden. Only last week, Trump was threatening Russia to accept an unconditional ceasefire, which has become almost a code word for keeping the war going later. But now he talks about negotiating a peaceful settlement. They're talking about territory swaps. I haven't heard that much about restoring Ukraine's neutrality. But how are you assessing the situation?
Well, I think this is significant progress in a way. First of all, we have to recognize that unlike the Biden administration, which essentially refused to talk to Russia at all or to listen to it, Secretary of State Blinken never once engaged seriously with Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart. The Trump administration has been open to dialogue. That's the first point. The second point is it has conducted that dialogue in an extremely amateurish fashion. There are now no known Russian experts in the National Security Council staff. The best people at the Department of State in the Foreign Service appear to have departed. There's no indication that any expertise is being drawn upon. Instead, we have Stephen Witkoff, a real estate mogul from New York, conducting a dialogue with Vladimir Putin in the absence of his own interpreter, note takers, or any other normal support for a serious diplomatic discussion. Still, he does appear to have listened sufficiently and spoken to the president. So President Trump now says he's prepared to listen directly to Vladimir Putin in Alaska, and that is progress. I think one has to, however, view it with some skepticism, as there's no indication on the record that Trump ever really listens to anyone. So we don't know at all what is going to happen. The final point is, and I think this is also healthy, there is now an emerging recognition, not only in Washington, but in Europe, in some parts of Europe, that Ukraine has de facto been partitioned. That is to say, the question is not whether the eastern oblasts will return to Ukraine or Crimea will return to Ukraine or not. The question is, what do we do about the legal status of these entities, and what contribution can that make to ending the war and establishing a peace? So I think these are significant changes. They're pregnant with implications, but we won't know until after the meeting takes place whether what I think is the best case, the best hope, which is that this starts a peace process. It starts a discussion which can move to a more professional level. Of course, we don't have an ambassador in Moscow now, or in Kyiv, as far as I can see. So this is all being run out of the president's gut feelings rather than any anything. There is no policy process operating in Washington to provide guidance to the president. So he's on his own. I think this is a positive development, but one we cannot really understand until it's over.
What is the objective here? Because usually one would set up clear goals. I mean, are they there to sign an agreement, like the latter stages when the state leaders, or are they there to start negotiations? Or, as some have suggested, they just want to learn what Russia wants, because it seems, I'm not sure if this is genuine or just setting the expectations low, but I would have assumed that they knew what the Russians want after, again, 6 months in the administration.
Well, this gets to the question of how the dialogue with the Russians has been managed and who is there to interpret it. We have no evidence that there's any professional interpretation of what Mr. Witkoff has heard, or even that he's confided in anyone with expertise. He appears to have misheard some things, which is not surprising. That happens. But this could be nothing more than the usual Trumpian maneuver, which is, if you can't take action, create the illusion of action. This is the illusion of something, what we don't know yet. Perhaps it is the beginning, as I said, of a more professionally conducted, more direct dialogue, and we must hope so, because, as President Trump keeps pointing out, somewhat ironically, because a lot of the people being killed in Ukraine are being killed by American weaponry supplied by him, and he was the first American president to provide offensive weaponry to Ukraine in his first term. But he notes that lots of people are dying in Ukraine. That is true. I think many more Ukrainians are dying than Russians, but nobody really knows what the numbers are, because they're classified or obscured or the subject of an information war and propaganda. So, here's this meeting. It's an opportunity for President Trump to hear directly from Vladimir Putin what Vladimir Putin has been saying consistently for years, namely that he's concerned to ensure the protection of Russian speakers in Ukraine, who were, in fact, attacked by other Ukrainians in an effort at forced assimilation, and that issue must be dealt with. And he has decided the only effective way to deal with it is through the annexation of the major Russian-speaking areas. Second, that Ukraine cannot have an anti-Russian posture and prosper or be at peace any more than Cuba can have an anti-American posture and be at peace or prosperous. Geopolitical realities exist, and Ukraine has no choice. Like Mexico, it has to have a good relationship with its more powerful neighbor. So there's that. And then third, of course, there's the issue of Ukraine's place in a reorganized European security architecture, which is something to be discussed down the road. I think these three things, in fact, are so intimately related that you can't solve one without addressing the others. And I suspect that was what President Trump may discover in this meeting in Alaska. Let me make one other point, and that is that even Volodymyr Zelensky, who has been adamant on behalf of the ultranationalist Ukrainians who keep him in power, that Ukraine will not yield territory, even he is beginning to talk about territorial swaps. I think talking about them in de facto rather than de jure terms is, as I indicated at the outset, a non-starter. It will not work. The de facto change exists already. It doesn't require an agreement to create it. It is a result of action on the battlefield. And the question is, how much of that battlefield result do you acknowledge? And the case is good for acknowledging all of it. So we'll see what comes out of this. My guess is what comes out of it will be a process. I hope it will be a peace process, not just a process aimed at a ceasefire, which I don't think is feasible without addressing all of the issues that Russia has said are at stake.
No, I think you're correct. That is, well, when the coup happened back in 2014, it's created two problems for the Russians. One was the suspension of very basic rights for Russian speakers, and the second was, of course, the possibility of NATO's, or the possibility, the obvious incursion of NATO into Ukraine. So this is why, more or less, my assumption was that the minimum for a deal for the Russians would have to be, obviously, for Ukraine to restore its neutrality, so no NATO at the foundations. But I always thought that on the territory issue, this is where it would be possible to negotiate. Now, they seem very adamant that Donbass is, well, that's written in stone. They want all of Donbass, so Ukraine will have to leave territories, even the territories that Russia doesn't have. But in terms of, and they would trade this away for territory, I guess, in Sumy and Kharkov, which the Russians are willing to trade away. Meanwhile, in Zaporozhye and Kherson, there might be some, the concession in terms of just dividing up because they're not holding the whole territory. Now, this is I can understand the Ukrainian side that this is very difficult to swallow, but given the collapse of the front lines, and everyone now, I think, even the most hawkish warmongers, starting to recognize that this is coming to an end. So do you think there is some possibility to make peace along those lines? Because I think this would be the minimum for Russia. They would like to take, again, all these four regions. Again, I might be wrong. They might want that as a minimum as well. But do you think this is a possible meeting point?
Well, one has to remember that there has been no bargaining. So these are opening demands or offers. I think the Russians are probably guilty of falling into the trap of the fallacy of sunk costs. They have spent a huge amount of blood and treasure and altered their international relationships in order to deal with this problem. I don't think they will yield easily on any of their demands. So those demands are there to be negotiated, but I would not expect much flexibility on the part of the Russians with regard to territorial issues. I think I should say a kind word about President Zelensky, which I'm not usually doing, but let's remember he ran on a platform of peace and the acceptance of the Minsk Accords. That was his electoral platform when he was elected. Very quickly, he was taken hostage by ultranationalist Ukrainians from Western Ukraine and by the British and the Americans who wanted to use Ukraine to isolate and weaken Russia. And when he actually agreed early on in March and April of 2022 to something that would have restored the Minsk Accords and restored Ukrainian neutrality, and presumably also have dealt with the issue of minority rights more broadly, he was immediately reversed by Boris Johnson, the British, and the Americans, with the strong support of ultranationalist Ukrainians who had attempted to impose forced assimilation, rather like what the Chinese have been doing in Xinjiang recently, on other Ukrainians. So I think one has to have a bit of a feeling of pity for Mr. Zelensky. He clearly did not intend to be put in the position he has been put in. He is an actor, and he has put on a very convincing display of an indomitable spirit. But in the end, he has no ability to compromise. So what's the conclusion there? The conclusion is that whatever happens in Alaska, Zelensky probably loses. He is the main loser from the event. Because if he agrees to something sensible like the territorial swaps you just outlined, I think he will fall victim to his own ultranationalist backers. And if he doesn't agree, President Trump will walk away from him, leaving him even more naked on the battlefield. You're absolutely correct. We are seeing now the collapse of the Ukrainian front as the Russians advance beyond fortified positions into Ukraine and reach particularly for all of Donetsk. So I think this, for Mr. Zelensky, this is a disaster. One last point. Although Europeans have begun to be a little more realistic, we've heard Mark Rutte, for example, admit the possibility of territorial exchanges, grudgingly. The fact is that sanctions relief, which is another Russian requirement, is in the hands of Europeans who show no inclination whatsoever to relax the sanctions and explore a more positive relationship with Russia. So the fly in the ointment is not just Zelensky's future, but also the question of whether Europe will take the initiative to come up with some sort of proposal for peace and stability on the subcontinent, or whether it will continue to be obdurate, in which case it will suffer the consequences of the Ukrainian collapse and the Russian advance, probably including Odessa, and thus turning Ukraine into a landlocked, crippled remnant of its former self. So I think there's a great deal at stake here, and I think we do have to have an eye on Ukrainian and European politics as well as on the bilateral interaction in Alaska.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point about Zelensky. People often forget that he was one of the voices for peace. He appeared on the news shows in which he was making the point in Ukraine, we shouldn't allow language to split us. I'm a Russian speaker. Russian speakers are wonderful. There's no problem with them. He traveled to Moscow on Red Square arguing, I'm here in Moscow. People don't hate Ukrainians. We can all get along. And he condemned the Bandera people for their, fascist traits while arguing, the peace is possible. And on this peace platform, he won 73% of the vote. And then, of course, very well documented, confronted by these different, let's say, fascist groups. I think that's a reasonable way of defining them, who, threatened his life, and eventually he reversed. We even had NGOs being, Western-financed NGOs warning that these were red lines, and essentially his entire platform. So it's, it is. It's one can't help feel bad about being talked into, going for war instead of peace, and then ending up in this situation. You did mention the Europeans, though, and this is something always. I guess this is a position that perplexes me the most, which is a bit strange given that I'm here. I can understand the Ukrainians, I can understand the Russians, I can now increasingly understand the Americans, but the Europeans, not so much, because I always make the point that Europe always tempted to position itself as the good West, moderating more of the aggressive impulses of America. But these days, the roles have been definitely switched, and I can't really put my finger on or define what the European positions are, because there is no talk really about strategy or key objectives or how to achieve the objectives. It's just catchphrases and slogans. So Russia is, Soviet Union, Putin is Hitler, stop him now, or he will invade Poland for some reason, and there's never any real discussion, and it can't be in discussion, because in a discussion you would need opposition, but there's no acceptance of opposition, because anyone who criticizes the policies would be pro-Putin and would have to be, purged from the political discourse. So how do you assess now what the Europeans want and the extent to which they can actually achieve it?
Well, I think there's no European discussion of the future, which is really quite irresponsible on the part of European leaders. Let me make a point here, and that is the Banderites, the followers of Stepan Bandera, control Ukraine. They control President Zelensky. They control the possibility of peace with Russia. They control Ukraine's relations with Poland, where, by the way, there are some brave souls who are advocating realism with respect to relationships with Russia now. That is to say, the Poles, who were the most viscerally anti-Russian of all Europeans, perhaps, recognize that they need to, on the one hand, arm themselves against Russia, that they need to rely on other Europeans to support their defense, but they also seem to be beginning to recognize that they need to have a decent relationship with Russia in their own interest. You don't see that elsewhere in Europe very much. And here's the question. So everybody says, well, the answer is Ukraine does not go into NATO, but it does go into the European Union. Now, let me ask you this question. Will the French accept Ukrainian agriculture in the European agricultural policy? Is that anything possible? But more importantly, would Europe accept a member state that was run by Banderites, by Stepan Bandera's heirs, the allies of the German SS? I think this is the real question. Nobody confronts it, because the answer to the Banderite problem is denial rather than acknowledgement that it is a problem. So Europe actually conceivably does share an interest with Russia in changing the ideological complexion of Ukraine, something that maybe people should be talking about. If the answer for Ukraine is to be integrated into the rest of Western Europe, rest of the West, if you will, then it can't do so if it professes values which are those of fascism. And that is not an unfair word to use in this context. So I think the disappointment about the silence, the default of European countries on their own future and the future of their own subcontinent, because it is a subcontinent, not a continent, the Greeks notwithstanding, it is part of Eurasia, and it can't escape that relationship. So, is Europe just going to be a spoiler? At the moment, that's what it looks like.
Yeah, the position is very strange as well. They demand to be part of the talks and the diplomatic settlement, but they don't want to talk to Russia. So, but again, it's a contradiction, but no one wants to address it, because if the whole idea of not doing diplomacy, boycotting diplomacy, it's so radical, but it's embraced now by everyone.
Well, interestingly, except Washington in its amateur hour under President Trump, he would like to do diplomacy, but of course he's gutted the capacity of the United States to conduct diplomacy and relied on cronies and amateurs. And, as I said, there is no Russian expert in the room these days. Not that experts are always right, but they do have a useful capacity to inform and question courses of action. And we don't have that anymore.
But, to assess what's going to happen in Alaska, whenever we talk about the U.S.-Russian relations, it fits into this wider question about I guess, world order. And after the Cold War, the U.S. was set on security through a hegemonic peace, so containing then China, Russia, more or less everyone. But now that the multipolar realities can't be ignored, um, I'm curious how you think it's likely that Washington will respond to this. I thought, again, you having worked with Kissinger and also in the diplomacy, what your thoughts were, because I kind of had three different hypotheses. That is either, continue to do the same, contain, Russia, China, contain everyone, or the second would be, make friends with Russia to create some divisions between the Russians and the Chinese. But this will be very hard because of the political culture after a century of this. But the third, which I see as the most likely, is that the US will seek to outsource the containment of Russia to the Europeans in Europe, and then the US is in a better position to engage with the Russians in Asia, not necessarily as a complete adversary. But again, it's oh, it's a huge changes in the international system. So any change is very difficult to do. It breaks up established consensus. So I was just curious, how do you see U.S. policies or reorganizing around the relationship with Russia?
The third possibility, which is that the United States would try to outsource the containment of Russia to Europe while focusing on containing China itself, is precisely what is advocated by some of the foreign policy professionals, strategic reasoners in this administration. For example, Elbridge Colby, who has been quite the Undersecretary for Policy at the Defense Department. He has been very open about in his advocacy of this. He also favors reducing the American footprint and commitment in West Asia as part of a movement to focus on the rise of China. So this is indeed a strain in American thought. But there's no evidence at all that President Trump shares this view. He seems to have an idea that one thought that he had an idea of the world being run by a small group of strong men, one of whom was himself. He respects Vladimir Putin for his ruthlessness and his power, and the same with Xi Jinping in China. And one thought that he did the same for Narendra Modi in India, but it turns out that he thinks he can bully India. So he's trying to do that. He can't bully China, and he knows he can't bully Russia. There are two competing visions, one of which is clearly, globally, I think the world is very much interested in multinodal politics, as I put it, since poles are the ends of a two-dimensional line. That's far too simple for the world that's emerging. Nodes connect many lines or channels of varying sizes, and they're three-dimensional, making turn in space and time. So that is probably the correct way of looking at what is coming out. But in that context, you spoke of the United States containing everybody. Actually, what we're doing is containing ourselves. We had a global clout that was quite extraordinary. We were an open economy, and that gave us tremendous influence on other countries' economic policies. We were the world policeman, in effect, and everybody deferred to our military power. We were able to cajole or pressure or persuade other countries to do things that they thought were not particularly in their interest. We were the principal most sought after peacemaker in places like West Asia, Israel, Palestine, and so forth. All this is gone. The United States no longer is interested in crafting trade and investment agreements. We're interested in shutting off imports, and we have approached investment in a remarkable way. The Secretary of the Treasury just declared that the various commitments that have been made by Japan, for example, supposedly, and by Europe to pump money into American companies, invest in the United States, enables us to direct the disposition of Japanese and European capital. This is a kind of hegemony that the world has never even experimented with. And since these commitments are worth as much as the paper they're written on, and there is no paper that they are written on, in other words, they're totally fictitious, this is delusional. But then much of the rest of the foreign policy of the Trump administration is delusional. And you can see this. Mr. Trump is racking up a whole series of fictitious peacemaking successes. Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, India and Pakistan. Pakistan has cleverly pocketed that and praised the president for that. The Indians, who are a bit more realistic, have been very annoyed by his taking credit for their foreign policy. We have now Azerbaijan and Armenia, supposedly, and this is all aimed at a Nobel Peace Prize. And one should not underestimate the probability that Mr. Trump is going to Alaska in pursuit of a visit to Oslo at some point. That he has the notion that if he accumulates enough fictitious peacemaking successes, he will get the honor that Obama got for being nothing except being of mixed race. So that, rankles him. Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize, ridiculously in my view, but Trump is very aggravated by that. So perhaps all he's doing is engaging in a fishing expedition to see what sort of flounder he can bottom fish up to the surface and serve to all-powerful Norwegians and their kin in Sweden. I know Norwegians take a dim view of Swedes and vice versa. But Mr. Trump obviously reveres the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, well, the Europeans, they're a strange breed, though, because they really resent Trump. I mean, if you look at the newspapers, the way the politicians speak, most in Europe are very, very hostile to him, but they're also, top of the line in terms of bootlicking. They, this is a daddy, we will do as we're told. But it all goes back. They don't like him, but they think, they can wait him out again for another 4 years and then everything will go back to normal. So just make sure he doesn't wreck too much when he's in place. And they assume he's very superficial. So if they just, suck up enough, then he will spare them. One thing which I always thought was great with Trump was he recognized this folly, this Kissinger's worst nightmare in terms of pushing the Russians and Chinese together. And especially on an anti-American platform, this is not something you want. But this is why it was so shocking to me, the bullying of India, because my impression from India now is that this is having a very big impact, the way they view the United States. And it was very unnecessary because the Indians seem often desperately pro-American in a way. They really want to get along as well as possible with the United States, not in an alliance system, but as a non-aligned power. So, but the conditioning to surrender their own, autonomy, their own foreign policy and dignity, that this is was one bridge too far. And the way he pushed this and bullied this, I think the alienation of India doesn't make any sense. Again, this is becoming another pushing India closer to both Russia and China. I mean, I can't really wrap my head around this. I'm trying to look for some, someone's behind the wheel, or, if there's some strategic objective, or simply just again, no one's behind the wheel. And this one, I can't really see any strategy or any point behind it.
Well, there's been, I began my diplomatic career in India, and I followed it carefully. At one point, I actually spoke a fair amount of Tamil, but I don't profess to understand a word of it now. But it's very clear that the Indians are a proud, independent country that will not yield their sovereignty to anyone else. They are available as partners, as they have shown with the Soviet Union, and later with the Russian Federation, but they will not be pushed around. And there have been many illusions on the American side about India based on a common heritage of democracy derived from the British tradition. But India does not pursue a foreign policy based on democratic ideology. It pursues a very realistic realpolitik policy. So disappointment, disillusionment is an intermittent reality in the U.S.-Indian relationship. Having said all of that, there are two countries, arguably, that are swing states that have been courted by other great powers or would-be great powers. The central one is India. The feeling has been that this is the country you can use to balance China. This is the country you can use to, in the case of the British, who've foolishly left the European Union, you can exploit the connections to India to offset the loss of markets on the continent, and so forth. And the other is Brazil. And so Trump has also savaged Brazil on an entirely internal domestic Brazilian political problem, which is the status of the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, and the operations of the Brazilian Supreme Court. So if you look for a strategy here, I think you will look in vain. There is no strategy. There is petulance. There is personal ambition. There is egocentric, almost solipsism, if you know the word, which solipsism is, in its extreme form, the idea that reality exists only in your head, and you can change reality by altering your view of it unilaterally. This is a trait of narcissists, and Mr. Trump is clearly a narcissist. So I don't see a strategy. And as I said, what I do see happening is multinodal politics emerging on a global level, and the U.S. containing itself. Or in other words, while the rest of the world is dancing to the drum of multipolarity, to use that word, the United States is off in a corner dancing to its own drummer, and severing its relations with the world, not building them, burning bridges, not building them. So this is not a strategy. This is a reflection of semi-psychotic behavior. I mean, including one of the characteristics of psychotic behavior is delusions, hallucinations. And we have them. We have them. You see in Mr. Trump's administration, let's not forget, he opened his administration by savaging the Danes over Greenland, by attacking the Canadians for their independence, and by proclaiming that he was going to take back the Panama Canal. Although non-interventionism is the great banner of Latin American foreign policy doctrine. And he has put in place a Secretary of State who has slashed and burned the diplomatic establishment that he inherited, proposes on occasion and then repents apparently to shut down all the American embassies in Africa, which Mr. Trump once termed shithole countries. This is not rational behavior by any standard. And you can say the same thing about the domestic political realities, the lawlessness of the administration, the theory that the president has unchecked power. So my final point here, Glenn, is I think anyone who imagines that the damage is reversible, easily reversible, or it's not permanent, needs to think again. You can't wait this out. Now, I mean, sometimes you can do that. I know lots of Chinese friends who reacted to the autocracy of Xi Jinping by saying, well, he too is mortal. We'll just wait, and in due course he'll disappear from the face of the earth, and we can get on with our lives in a new framework. You can't do that in this case. Let me end with an obvious point, which seems to have been forgotten, and that is, whenever you negotiate a transaction, you are also negotiating a relationship. Now, perhaps in New York real estate, you don't care about the relationship that attaches to the property swap, because what is happening in Alaska bears great resemblance to a real estate operation. Ukraine is bankrupt, but it has real assets. So let's trade those assets for Ukrainian independence of some sort. In other words, a building exchange. I have a skyscraper, you have an apartment block. Let's just trade them, and we're all even. This is not sophisticated geostrategic reasoning. I don't want to say that is all that is involved in this, but it's not implausible that that is all that is involved in this meeting. We shall see.
This is always a question whether or not Trump properly understands the conflict, because, again, when he began to refer to this solely as a Ukraine-Russia war, where he can play the mediator, and somehow the solution is now a territory swap only, I just sometimes wonder if he can appreciate that the territorial dispute is the consequence of the conflict, not the source of it. And but again, it's never clear who he seeks to manipulate or deceive, because, again, if he last week called for an unconditional ceasefire as the more war hawkish people in the administration and in Europe wants, and now he switches to this thing, he must be deceiving someone, I'm thinking, because if he was calling for unconditional ceasefire, was that to get the Hawks off his back, or isn't he now deceiving the Russians? Because at the beginning of his administration, he did call for having this, he said with Hegseth, you have to accept that the Ukraine can't be part of NATO, and then there has to be territorial concessions. And then he had this huge backlash, and then he walked away from it. So, I mean, he's either deceiving his own political side, or the US and the European hawks, or he's deceiving the Russians. But he's definitely deceiving someone. I can't put my finger on it, though.
Let me make two comments. First, the contradiction in the case of Ukraine is the same as the contradiction in the case of Palestine. On the one hand, we are co-belligerents, and the other hand, we pretend to be mediators. Well, you can't be both. You have to be one or the other. I suspect that he wants to be a mediator in the case of Ukraine, and that he's probably going to cut Ukraine off from American military supplies, which, by the way, we don't really have anyway, given the problems we have with the military-industrial base. So that's one comment. This is not unprecedented, and it doesn't work. The second comment I'd make is that his own base is, as I thought they might, turning against him. He's being condemned by MAGA figures, major figures in MAGA, for example, doubling down on the Ukraine war rather than ending it as he said he would in 24 hours. for involving us even deeper in forever wars in the West Asian region, for actually carrying out, for increasing budget deficits with his great, big, beautiful bill, and so forth. No, there are other complaints that might be made and are made, but these are his own supporters turning on him. And so he's under some pressure to produce a peace in Ukraine from his own people. And we shall see how that plays out.
Well, I have some cautious optimism, at least, as you started off saying. At least this is the right direction of talking to each other, and
Exactly.
this whole idea that you don't talk to the other side and it's immoral to discuss their national interests. I mean, if we can overcome this, at least there's some light at the end of the tunnel. But yes, thank you also always for your input and letting me pick your brain. So thanks again.
Well, keep up the good work, man.